My name is Evelyn Hart. I am a 44-year-old corporate attorney based in Seattle, Washington. I received a notification from the estate attorney's office. The subject line read, "Final disbursement attached." I opened it expecting the expected. Instead, I found a scanned will, signed 3 months ago, leaving my late father's $10 million estate to my husband's name entirely. I received nothing, no explanation, just one footnote. She agreed to this. I stared at the screen and felt nothing. Not rage, not panic. Just precision forming. We met at a compliance conference in Chicago. 2 young associates dodging panels for overpriced coffee and quietly watching the snow fall through hotel windows. He was charming, if slightly performative, with the kind of laughter that arrived too easily and lingered a second too long. I was more careful, more measured, still balancing grief from my mother's death with the steep curve of first-year billables. But he pursued with precision ever too much, always enough. Within 2 years, we had merged our lives and leases. We both advanced quickly. I made partner after 8 years, one of the youngest at the firm. He left litigation for corporate advisory, a move I encouraged during his burnout. I also carried the details of our shared life, the mortgage on our Queen Anne house, the bookkeeping for his consultancy, the coordination of care for his ailing mother when he could not bear the hospital visits. The house had been my dream, a craftsman with original woodwork and a garden just large enough to remind me of my mother's. When she passed, she left me a small inheritance enough to cover our down payment. He called it our home, but only I made it one. There was a photo in the upstairs hallway of us in front of it, taken the day we moved in. His arm was around me. My eyes were closed. I had just finished a 90-hour week. His smile reached the camera. Mine did not. For years, I dismissed the imbalance as a phase. His hours mattered more because his clients were volatile. Once because he needed me to stabilize the business during a downturn, I rationalized each one, but adjustment became a one-way pattern. He took up space, and I edited myself down. My mother once told me, "You cannot build something lasting with someone who thinks your foundation is temporary." The legacy she left me was not just financial. It was a warning I ignored. The shift was not sudden. It was incremental, too quiet to name, too consistent to ignore. It began with his phone. He started sleeping with it under his pillow, claiming client emergencies, but I never heard it ring. Notifications were silenced. Then came the passwords. One evening, I reached for his laptop to send an itinerary to our travel agent, a task I had done for years, and was met with a locked screen. I always nodded. That same week, he canceled our weekend with his sister in Bainbridge, citing a mandatory strategy, retreat for a new client. I asked for details. He answered in vague abstractions. Investor alignment, time zone conflicts, non-disclosure headaches. The next day, I ran into an old colleague of his at the courthouse, a woman who used to sit beside him. On advisory panels, when I asked if she would be at the retreat, her face registered confusion. "He stepped back from that group last year," she said. "He told me he needed time to recalibrate." I smiled. I said nothing. That night, I watched him sleep with the ease of someone untouched by consequence. There were more signs, each insignificant on its own, but corrosive in sequence. Receipts from restaurants I had never been to, signed in his name. Email drafts erased. Browser histories wiped. He started asking questions he once knew the answers to about my firm's quarterly cycles, my assistant's schedule, whether I would be in court or deposition on specific days. At first, I attributed it to stress. We were both aging into our careers, growing more protective of our solitude. But then I found myself rehearsing explanations for his behavior to no one in particular, as if trying to reframe a story already. Cracking. The intimacy that once felt implicit became staged. He complimented my appearance with words that landed out of rhythm, like an actor reading lines in a dialect not his own. When we made love, it was mechanical, timed between work calls without laughter or pause. Instead, I listened for the moments he said too much, or not enough. I began to observe our life the way an outsider might, as though taking notes in a room already being emptied. Once, while cleaning the guest room, I opened a drawer to find a set of keys I did not recognize and a sealed envelope with no address. I left it untouched. A week later, it was gone. I never asked. The erosion was almost elegant in its design. No scandal, no confrontation, just the steady deletion of certainty. One evening, as I stood at the sink rinsing wine glasses, I caught my reflection in the window. I looked older, not in the skin, but in the eyes. I realized I had not been kissed with intention in months. I realized I no longer expected to be end. That was when I understood. Betrayal does not arrive with thunder. It accumulates in silence. Until the weight of what you do not say becomes louder than what you do, the awakening did not arrive in a single moment. It was cumulative. provoked not by heartbreak but by pattern recognition, by the quiet logic of inconsistencies too carefully arranged. I began with our shared cloud storage account, a space we once used for travel itineraries, tax receipts, and grocery lists. He had not updated it in months. At first I assumed neglect. Then I saw the permissions had changed. He had underestimated my memory. I remembered the exact naming convention he used for client folders' initials date. One word which synced automatically to a folder on our shared home server. That was where the trail began. Buried within a financial subfolder was a scanned wire transfer receipt, timestamped just after midnight on a day he had claimed to be in Portland for business. The recipient's name was unfamiliar. The amount was not. It matched the exact sum that had disappeared from one of our dormant joint accounts, a cushion we kept untouched for emergencies. He had withdrawn it 2 weeks earlier. There were other files, a pre-approval letter from a private bank, addressed to him alone, listing a property in Austin, an unsigned lease agreement with a digital timestamp 2 months before my father's final hospitalization. A blank schedule marked February transition. I did not cry, I did not confront, I documented. I captured everything: screenshots, PDF exports, backups, saved 2 encrypted drives he did not know existed. I moved with precision because emotion would only cloud the geometry of betrayal. My clarity became my asset. I contacted our estate attorney under the guise of updating my mother's trust. I asked about mechanisms of revocation, beneficiary reassignment, and inheritance structures that bypassed spousal consent. His tone shifted. He asked if everything was all right. I said yes. That was not a lie. It was finally becoming so. I reviewed years of financial records, most of which I had organized, and found slow redirection of assets, shell invoices, even small insurance transfers, each calibrated to avoid scrutiny. He had been building a second life. Not reckless, not romantic, strategic. A parallel architecture constructed from my blind trust. I traced IP addresses from logged document activity and saw one repeatedly connected to a private workspace rental. On the east side of the city, I started visiting that neighborhood on lunch breaks, never entering, only watching. He never saw me. That was intentional. When I returned home each evening, I did not change anything. I cooked. I asked polite questions. I made the bed with symmetrical folds. He assumed my stillness was resignation. Each day I became more deliberate. I initiated quiet conversations. With 2 colleagues in fiduciary law, I reviewed prenuptial clauses I had not revisited in a decade. I found an overlooked amendment my mother had filed the year before her death, placing a discretionary veto power in the trustee's hands. It was buried in a footnote. I remembered her voice saying, "Keep your signature light, but your control absolute." She had known, and now I did. When I looked at him across the dinner table, I did not see the man I married. I saw a strategist, and I realized I was one too. The only difference was that I had waited until now to play. The first call I made was to Marla Keene, my mother's former estate attorney and the woman who drafted the original trust. Economical in words, she poured 1 glass of wine and left the second untouched. I brought a folder marked routine review, though nothing inside was routine. Recent will leaving my father's estate to a man he barely tolerated in life? I nodded once. The oversight clause? She asked. I did. I had forgotten about it for years, but my mother had insisted that any disbursement of her inheritance, event of conflict, was the firm's senior partner, a friend of the family, discreet and by the book. Legally, I could pause the transfer pending verification of good faith. Financially, I could freeze the account entirely under suspicion of undue influence. What I had was not just suspicion. I had timestamps, I had IP logs, I had paper trails, so tightly woven they could only be deliberate. That night, I contacted Vincent Reyes, a forensic accountant I had worked with in a prior merger dispute. I forwarded him encrypted backups of every digital trace I had gathered. Within 48 hours, he produced a preliminary report. Staggered asset reallocation, disguised fund transfers through consultancy retainer agreements, false expense, coding tied to shell companies registered under modified initials. Nothing illegal yet, but everything suggestive of fraud. I established surveillance over our joint accounts, placed flags on credit activity, and rerouted all future estate correspondence to my direct line. I spoke with no one else, not friends, not colleagues, not even his sister, who had once been close to me. I knew silence had more strategic weight than confrontation. Of control at home, I kept my movements neutral. He mistook my quiet for fatigue. He had no idea I had already initiated private arbitration under the trustee clause. He was planning an exit, but I had already closed the door. I found the envelope again, the one that had gone missing, and this time it was in his luggage. Inside was a property deed unsigned, naming him as sole owner and listing his marital status as unattached. The date on the form preceded my father's death by 4 weeks. That was the detail that shifted everything. It transformed what had been betrayal into documented premeditation. Emotion had no place in this stage. I was not reacting. I was executing. I composed a timeline, dates, transfers, communications, and matched them against his travel records. Each lie had a time. By the time my attorney filed the legal hold on the final disbursement, the structure was already complete. I did not need to win in court. I needed only to create enough legal exposure to trigger arbitration. Had tried to outmaneuver would be mine to wield. I was not preparing to fight. The way all ruptures do, one announced under soft lighting, as if reality had rehearsed nothing. He was in the kitchen pouring himself a drink, the amber spiraling into crystal-like ritual. I had just returned from a client dinner, my coat still draped over one arm. Heels soundless against the hardwood I had refinished myself 2 years prior. He looked up, smiled faintly, and asked, "Long day?" I studied his face for a beat too long, then set my bag down and replied evenly, "Productive." I waited. Not for a confession, just for quiet. Dated 3 months before my father died. Did you know about it? He hesitated, but not long enough for guilt. Just calculation. Your father made his decisions, he said, swirling the ice. You always knew he trusted me with the finances. I did not respond to the deflection. The signature was real, I continued, but the phrasing in the footnote was not his. He never wrote like that. You coached him. His smile thinned, but never disappeared. Evelyn, he said, tone patronizing. I understand this is difficult, but your father made arrangements. He wanted me to have continuity over his business interests. That includes liquidity. I watched him closely, not for the words, but for the muscles around his mouth, how they twitched when he lied. Liquidity, I repeated softly. Is that what you call the house in Austin? The trust-backed insurance policy? The offshore retainer payments that began the month after his stroke? He blinked. Not wide, just once. You are misinterpreting paperwork, he said. This is not the time to let grief distort. I am not grieving, I interrupted, voice flat. Not anymore. He set the glass down carefully, as if the weight had changed. You have no idea what you are implying, he said. This is your father's legacy. I nodded once. Yes, and I have secured it. The silence between us was not empty. It was calculation versus clarity. He stepped forward, softening his voice. I understand you are upset, but if we start weaponizing estate language, no, I said calmly. You already did. You just assumed I would not notice. Or that if I did, I would falter. He laughed lightly, but there was no amusement in it. You really think you can undo this with a few flagged files and dramatic pauses? I smiled then. Not out of cruelty, but completion. That was the moment the shift occurred, not in me, but in him. He blinked again. He tilted his head as though recalibrating the version of me he had filed away as manageable. You are overreacting, he said. This isn't a courtroom. I placed it on the counter beside his drink. Arbitration notice, I said. Effective immediately. He picked up the envelope as if it might burn. You did this without talking to me? I turned then, coat still folded over one arm, the front door behind me. No, I said. I am talking to you now. And then I left. Not with triumph, but with precision. I did not slam the door. I did not look back. I gave him nothing, no rage, no breakdown, no closure, just a silence large enough to unravel in. That was my power. And I had only just begun to use it. It took less than 10 days for the silence to begin doing what confrontation never could. His lawyer reached out, first an associate from a mid-tier firm downtown, who opened the call with forced civility and the kind of careful diction that signals immediate damage control. He asked if I would be willing to revisit certain terms. Informally, before engaging in what he called formal proceedings, I said I preferred clarity over compromise. I offered no elaboration. The silence on his end lasted 3 seconds longer than was comfortable. Then the tone shifted. They had seen the filings. They knew the arbitration clause had been activated under a trustee oversight trigger. They understood the distribution. Hold was legal and binding. But what they had not anticipated, what he had not prepared them for, was the breadth of documentation I had quietly compiled. Archives at times and locations matching only his devices. Transaction logs rerouted through intermediary accounts. Metadata, proving edits made to estate drafts from an IP. The signature on the revised will was real, but the language, the insertions, the clarifying clauses had been added after the original draft. Digital timestamping confirmed it. The evidence was not emotional, it was procedural. The law responded to structure, not sentiment. And I had built a structure that left no room for narrative manipulation. What followed was the beginning of his unraveling. He stopped showing up to his co-working space. The previous month, discreetly, but definitively, the emergency hearing came quickly. His counsel tried to argue undue stress, emotional confusion, even mutual understanding and effort to reduce everything to the blur of grief and unspoken wishes. But the court responded only to data. The estate records the flagged inconsistencies. When asked to explain the missing consultation records from my father's final month of life, he deferred. When asked why certain bank documents bore his initials but no legal authority, he claimed verbal consent. But consent in fiduciary law must be provable, and there was no proof. The hearing ended without resolution, only exposure. The judge ordered a full financial review. He was instructed to submit personal and business financials for retroactive audit. His face did not collapse. It hollowed. He looked not defeated, but unfamiliar, like a man trying to remember a version of himself that could still be believed. I remained seated the entire time, expression neutral, notes folded in my lap. I did not speak unless asked. I did not correct his lies. I let the evidence do that for me. Outside the courthouse, I passed him without pause. He called my name. Once I did not turn that night, his sister called me. She sounded hesitant, confused. He said you blindsided him, she said. He said you twisted things. I said only, I did not twist anything. I unknotted what was already there. And I hung up before the next question could form. In the weeks that followed, his social circle narrowed. The consultancy's site was taken offline. His name was quietly removed from several advisory boards. There were whispers, not loud, not scandalous, just persistent. The kind that creates space around a man's reputation. He tried to initiate direct contact once through a letter, once through a mutual acquaintance. I ignored both. I knew now that silence is not passive. It is a choice, a method, a weapon. And in its pressure he began to fold, not loudly, not dramatically, but inevitably. The narrative he had crafted of control, of inheritance, of quiet victory was no longer his to direct. It was dissolving, cell by cell. In the shadow of the truth, he thought I would never find the clarity to name. By the time settlement negotiations began, the tone had shifted. Not just his but everyone's. His new counsel approached with the language of compromise, their posture leaning toward de-escalation, their offers punctuated by phrases like minimizing exposure and closing the chapter with dignity. The forensic audit had not yet gone public, but the risk loomed, and with it, leverage I never needed to exploit. I was not interested in destruction. That would have meant staying tied to him through the long corridors of litigation, each filing another tether. I wanted closure, not conquest. Through my attorney, I proposed terms both simple and absolute. A full return of the estate assets under temporary hold, a formal withdrawal of any claims to the trust in perpetuity, and a legally binding NDA that prevented him from speaking about the estate or any future financial context. He could keep the consulting income he had generated independently, minus the shell accounts tied to diverted funds. He would admit nothing, but he would keep nothing that was not his to begin with. There would be no trial, no public unspooling of motive or character, only paperwork, signatures, endings. When he signed the agreement, he did so with a single stroke without looking up. I watched him through the screen during the final Zoom session, his face drawn, thinner, wearing the look of a man who had come prepared to negotiate but instead encountered something far more punishing, indifference. He tried to thank me once. Out of habit or obligation, I could not tell. I said nothing. The settlement was filed 2 days later. The funds were restored. The trust was resealed. His name was removed entirely, and no record of his involvement remained within the estate's public ledgers. That was the precise nature of justice. I had sought not revenge, not retribution, but a clean severance. There would be no memoirs, no relitigation through whispers. He would live with the truth, unnamed but permanent. I would move forward without needing to explain myself to anyone. That was the moral high ground my mother once described, standing above what you could ruin, and choosing instead to walk past it. In the final review meeting, my attorney asked if I wanted to attach a statement to the NDA, something about closure or intent. I declined. Some things do not require commentary. They only require conclusion. And I had reached mine with no spectacle, no cruelty, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had protected what mattered and lost nothing I needed to keep. I sold the house in early spring. Just as the dogwood trees began to bloom along the fence line, my mother and I once painted together. It was not a rushed decision, nor a symbolic purge. It was simply time. The house had served its purpose. It held the silence, the unraveling, the long hours of waking up to who I had become, but it no longer held me. I left the photo in the upstairs hallway when I staged the sale, not out of sentimentality, but as a record of a version of myself that no longer existed. The buyer was a young couple expecting their first child. I handed them the keys without ceremony and walked away without looking back. With the proceeds, I did what my mother would have done. I opened the Heart Foundation in her name. an estate and legal mentorship fund for first-generation law students, navigating the brutal, often invisible systems of access and exclusion. The first scholarship recipient was a 26-year-old daughter of an immigrant farmer. Preparing for her second year at my alma mater, she cried when we met. I did not. But I felt something deeper, a stillness I had not known in years. Peace is not relief. It is recognition. A week after the final settlement closed, I received an envelope in the mail, no return address. No handwriting. Inside was a cashier's check in the amount of $1,020.17, and a single note typed in all caps to cover what was never mine. I folded it once, placed it in my drawer, and never cashed it. Some debts are not financial. Some apologies are not owed. I accepted it for what it was. Not closure, not reconciliation, just a gesture too late to matter. 3 months later, I accepted an invitation to join an international legal ethics advisory board headquartered in Lisbon. I packed lightly. I left the winter coats behind. I boarded the plane alone without telling many people, without explaining. Some changes do not require witness. On my first morning in Portugal, I walked along the narrow streets toward the water, the air warm and unhurried. No one knew my name. No one expected anything. I paused at a small cafe, ordered a coffee, and sat in the sun with nothing urgent to be solved. For the first time in years, there was no story to manage, no silence to keep, no version of myself I needed to protect. I was not recovering. I was not rebuilding. I was already whole. And that was the real inheritance. What to carry and knowing when to let the rest go.